Kwanzaa. It's an annual cultural celebration of African American heritage, unity, and community, observed from December 26th to January 1st. I sat down with St. Michael College's Director of Institute for Equity and Justice, Dr. Jolivet Anderson Duoneng, to talk about what Kwanzaa is and how we can all celebrate it. Thank you so much for joining us on In Depth today.
Thank you for having me.
So talk to me about what Kwanzaa is and who can celebrate it.
Kwanzaa is an African American celebration, a holiday. It is not, as some people think, the Black Christmas or the African American Christmas, and anyone and everyone can celebrate Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa is based off of 7 principles, and it's rooted in the Kiswahili language. It was actually a holiday founded by Maulana Karenga and a few other people. And the holiday looks at 7 principles that African Americans should think about and live and put into practice every day of the year, and how we think about ourselves individually, how we think about our struggle and our history in the United States, and how we think about community and economics and faith and all of these different kinds of things. And I think Maulana Karenga once said in his book, The Quotable Karenga, that there are many populations of people that are immigrant populations of people that have come to the United States of America, and they've managed to gather themselves together and create community and build economic strongholds. And the African American community, because of its history, had not done some of those key things that he identified inside of those 7 principles. So that is what Kwanzaa is really about. You can practice Kwanzaa regardless of whatever faith you may be. And it is really about building community.
What does celebrating Kwanzaa look like?
Oh, it could be a wide range of things. I started celebrating Kwanzaa probably over 20 years ago when I was living in Jackson, Mississippi at the time. And we would gather at the Medgar Evers Park in a gymnasium, and we would have speakers. We would have musical guests. There would be poets and musicians. There would be people that would give lectures. And there would be food and celebrations. There would be vendors that sold cultural gifts that you could use, whether it was jewelry or clothing that was representative of Africa or people in the African diaspora. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand. This diaspora, some people say diaspora, is a word that means the spreading or across. So wherever people of African descent have immigrated, migrated, or settled in the United States or any part of the world, actually, is called the diaspora. So my being a descendant of enslaved people and free people of color in North Louisiana since the 1700s, I'm still a part of the African diaspora, even though my relatives and I have 7 generations on my mom's side and on my dad's side that go back in this land, but we still see ourselves as connected to the continent of Africa.
And talk to me about celebrations here in our region, in Vermont and Northern New York. They look very different compared to when you first started celebrating Kwanzaa outside of the state of Vermont. What do they look like here in our region?
I think they're similar, right? People gather. Sometimes people only gather for the final day, which is Imani. And Imani is a Kiswahili word that means faith. So there is a feast on that day, and people gather, and we have different kinds of food. And it's really a communal type vibe or situation. And then on the other days, it all depends on the theme, right? So if it's Kujichagulia, which means self-determination, you may have people that come in and talk about political struggles or movements that have helped basically bring forth democracy and in the United States. But what does that look like? What does that struggle look like? And here in Vermont, it's similar. It's the same. People can be creative about how they want to celebrate Kwanzaa, and it could take on many different, methods, ways, forms, or fashions.
How have you seen, as a Vermonter, celebrations in Kwanzaa grow in Vermont?
I actually, in all honesty, I've only been here for 4 to 5 years, and the community celebrations that I know of happen around the Black Artist Showcase, which is when poets get together to celebrate each other and to share their works with each other. So I basically take the route or go into Kwanzaa through the arts. So I would be either asked to come and do poetry, or I would come and sit and watch other people perform. So it's similar to what I've experienced in Mississippi, in Louisiana, and even in Indiana when I lived there. The celebrations are the same. And we always bring out the Kanara, right, which is a candle holder, and it has 7 candles on it. And the center candle is always black. And then there's 3 green candles and 3 red candles on either side. And you light a candle a day. So those are the basic traditional things, ceremonial things that are done, right? And there's always a certain setup, that you would see. And when those things are done, and then, there are other components that are brought in after that.
And when we talk about social justice and celebrating Kwanzaa, for example, how can we continue to grow and learn with a holiday like Kwanzaa when it comes to social justice and supporting our whole community?
When it comes to social justice, I think Kwanzaa is the perfect way for people who are African American or African diaspora to gather to have discussions. For someone like myself who's a professor, to lead discussions, or other people in the community to have these sit-down sessions. I know that the people over at the Richard Kemp Center do active things like this where we have to meet and we have to discuss and talk about what citizenship means. What does it mean to be a citizen of the world, but specifically what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States, and more specifically a citizen in the state of Vermont, or whatever town or township or city that one lives. So when we talk about social justice, we're basically saying what is the right and wrong of how we treat human beings. And I think Kwanzaa's principles, right, they do that for us. They give us the framework that we need to open up the discussions so that we can figure out what does it mean to live in a nation of 350 plus million people, all operating under we the people of the United States. And so we have to have those kinds of discussions as an inroad to actually understand what social justice means and how it is actually put into practice. And it's for everybody in the community. I know that there are conversations now about what's going on with our immigrant populations and communities and families who are part of the Somali community because of things that have been said and how people have been referred to as trash or garbage. And when we look at the principles of Kwanzaa, and also when we look at the principles of Catholic social teachings, because I am a professor at St. Michael's College, we have to understand that we look at the dignity of all human beings. Every human being has value, has worth, and every human being has the capacity to make the choices about how they want to live in our world and how they want to contribute to the betterment of society, the public good and the common good. And Kwanzaa is a perfect opportunity and a framework for those people who want to learn and want to grow. And it's a way to look at it through the African American experience. And the African American experience has always been about helping all people.
How have you seen participation and people celebrating Kwanzaa change and grow throughout the years?
I think it's similar to what I said earlier. It takes on a cultural and historical, look when you're at the events. But in this time, in this day and age, it does take on a different way of looking at society and having conversations that actually teach people and try to train people on, how they can look at history to find some solutions and answers to things that they may or may not understand. And I think especially with large immigrant populations from the continent of Africa and other parts of the world, to really understand what's happening in our present moment, understanding Black struggle and African American history and culture provides some of the answers to the questions of why and how we got to the present moment.
Jolivette, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for having me. I appreciate being asked to come and share.